heard a story, I don't know where, but I did hear a story about a couple that moved into a new house. Moved into their new house, got everything, settled, and their bedroom happened to be upstairs in the house, and their window overlooked the driveway of their neighbor's house. And the first morning after their first night in their new house, the wife walks over to the window and she's looking through it, and she notices that the car in the neighbor's driveway is filthy. It's filthy, just needs to get cleaned. And she just took a mental note of that, like, oh, that's gross. That is the dirtiest car I've ever seen. They need to get that cleaned. Why don't they do that? And she proceeded to do the same thing day after day for a number of weeks, just thinking some pretty terrible things about the neighbors. She'd never met them. And she's just thinking, how lazy must they be? This is just crazy. The dirtiest car. They have no pride in their possessions. They just need to get that car cleaned. Well, one morning she woke up, looked out the window, expecting to see the same filthy car, and it wasn't filthy. And so she's excited. She excitedly says to her husband, "Look, they cleaned the car. It's been filthy for weeks." And the husband says, "Honey, no, I washed the windows yesterday. The windows were really dirty. The car hasn't been dirty at all." Now, that's obviously a very silly story, but I think you get the point. The moral of the story should be easy to grasp, right? Before you go and start, thinking things about other people and accusing them and criticizing them, you need to first fix what's right in front of you. The problem could be you and not other people. You need to fix your own issues before you go pointing out the issues of others. And people, even Christians, yes, Christians can do this all too much. We can point out the flaws, the sins, the issues of other people very quickly, too quickly, in fact. And the problem is whenever we are noticing other people's issues before we begin to even notice our own. And Jesus tells a quick little parable in Matthew 7 that brilliantly addresses this issue. And if this parable, these short 5 verses are not understood, if they're not understood and applied correctly, then you can easily and quickly turn into a self-righteous, judgmental, hypocritical person. Before you even realize that that's what's going on with your life, you can be that type of person. So turn to Matthew 7 if you're not there already. Surely this is a familiar passage. Maybe you grew up in the church and you heard this taught several times in children's church. But as we read this today, let's just make sure this is not just a familiar passage, but we've worked through this in our own minds, that we understand what Jesus is saying, and we ultimately look at our own lives and we do what it takes to keep ourselves from being self-righteous, from being hypocritical, from being pure in this regard. So let's look at Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 1. It says, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is a log in your own eye?" Verse 5, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Not surprisingly, these are some of the most popular verses among people that are not Christians and who don't care about the Bible whatsoever. They love these verses. They will resort to them, and it's even popular among people that profess to be Christians who could really benefit from CBI's Interpreting the Bible class. Lots of people who have the wrong idea about this passage and they need to understand, right? And they love the way that it starts. "Judge not, that you be not judged." Hey, you can't judge me. You can't say anything about me. Don't talk about my life. Don't talk about what you think I should be doing better. Don't talk about where I've messed up. Just leave it out of here. You can hear it now. You can hear these people saying, "See, only God can judge me," right? Miley Cyrus was right, No one knows what I'm talking about. But that's what they're thinking, right? They love that song. It's their anthem. I'd like to throw this verse at anyone who brings any sort of accountability in front of them, any sort of correction, anything like that. This is where people will love to go, judge not. Judge not. That's what Jesus says. Now, you get the point, right? They use this because they don't want to feel convicted. They don't want to be confronted about their issues. And Jesus certainly did not give us this parable to tell us that no one can hold us accountable. He didn't give us this parable to tell us that no one is allowed to hold us accountable or to correct us or anything like that. Jesus is teaching through this parable, through these short verses, that we need to avoid hypocrisy, and we need to avoid self-righteousness by first evaluating our own behavior, our own life, our own problems, especially before we are going to pass judgment on someone else, before we're going to correct someone else's behavior. There is a proper time and place to exercise wise judgments. It's an issue of wisdom and discernment now. He's not saying there should never be a time where you use wisdom to figure out whether or not you should do something, or you should hang out with someone or befriend someone or date someone. Of course, there are many different situations that call for us to use wisdom in making judgment calls, as we call them, right? I just named a few. You don't want to surround yourself with ungodly friends. You don't want to be dating someone ungodly. You have to make judgment calls about certain things, right? And that's not you saying, oh, yeah, look at that, you're a terrible person, right? We're going to get to something like that here in a minute. But it's not wrong, first of all, to make certain judgment calls when it comes to wisdom and wanting to lead a godly life, right? But isn't it interesting how it's so easy? It's so much easier to notice the sins of others. It's so much easier to notice the problems of other people before you notice your own sins. I'm sure you've all been there before, where you've been taking note of an issue in your friend or your sibling or your parents maybe and their issues, and you take that to heart and you're upset about it, but then you haven't really dealt with what's going on inside your own heart. You haven't dealt with what's going on in your own life. It's easy to think that you're doing everything right. It's easy to think that you've got it all figured out and you're doing everything right when all you notice about other people is the wrong that they do. So, exercising wise judgment, Jesus is getting at, it does not mean that he wants us to be excessive about pointing out when other people are wrong, being excessive about criticizing other people. In fact, that's exactly what Jesus is warning against in verse number 2, when he says, "For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." So the first step in making sure that we are not becoming these self-righteous and hypocritical, judgmental people is, number one, I want you to write down, beware an overly critical attitude. Beware. Be aware of that in your life. Whenever you pass judgment on others, whenever you are dealing with these issues of wisdom like we talked about, you better make sure that your judgment is fair, that the standard that you are judging others on is the standard that you ultimately would like to be judged by too. So this judgment that Jesus is condemning is the judgment that is obsessed with finding faults in other people. The judgment that will just sit back and watch and wait for other people to mess up so that you can criticize them, so that you can say something. The kind that is always pointing out the flaws in other people before it's noticing anything going on in its own heart. The kind that the attitude of even condemnation that fall short. The kind that will write people off and say they're untrustworthy, they're foolish, or they're less than I am because they messed up in that regard, and I'm doing a great job in certain areas. And so it's really easy to fall into this hypercritical attitude and have this hypercritical mindset. We need to avoid that. I'm going to give you a few things to check, examples of what an overly critical attitude might be. First one is this: if you are too quick to point out when others mess up. Not just in word, in approaching and confronting them, but in thought as well. Think about the way that you think towards other people. Are you very quick to just be on the lookout and notice for when someone falls short, for when someone messes up? Are you the type of person who doesn't just keep it in your thought life, but you actually take a step forward and open your mouth and you tell them when they messed up? You tell them. You have this overly critical attitude. And perhaps this is the most important one to point out, right? Perhaps this is the most relatable way that this over criticism shows itself in life. Maybe this is the one that most of us need to reckon with. This person cannot really tell someone things that they think they're doing well. If someone was to ask you, well, what do you think I'm doing well with my life? You wouldn't really have anything to say. You would just say, oh, I don't know, but I know that you're doing X, Y, and Z wrong, and you should get it fixed because you're just way too concerned with looking at where they're falling short. This person has a very bad habit of giving advice when it's not asked for and frankly not needed because you just want to go and share your thoughts about what they should be doing and how you think that they could be a better person, a better Christian, a better student, a better you name it. Second thing is maybe you have an overly critical attitude if you have a difficult time being gracious with other people. If you have a hard time giving grace to others when you would give grace to yourself. When other people mess up, maybe it's hard for you to overlook. Whenever a friend of yours or someone close to you hurts you, it's really difficult for you to give grace to that person. Maybe you hold on to it for too long, and maybe it's just that when your expectations aren't met by someone in some situation, you write them off. Maybe not forever, but for a period of time, you have them in some sort of purgatory in your mind where you're like, I can't believe they did this. I can't believe they would have done that to me. How could they do that? And all you're paying attention to is what they did, how they messed up. You're being hypercritical. Another thing to look for is that maybe you're not gentle in conversation. You're not tactful. It's so important to have tact in conversation, not just in ministry and discipleship, but in every conversation you're in. You need to think about not just what am I saying, not just how am I saying it, but how is this person perceiving what I'm saying. So it's an issue of wisdom here. We need discernment. We should ask God to give us tact in our conversations. But this overly critical attitude, it shows itself in harshness whenever you're speaking to other people. Maybe you think that you're doing the right thing. Maybe you think you're showing love to someone by speaking up and sharing with them what you think they need to do better with. It's coming across as harsh. It's coming across as not gentle. It's not good. It's not right to do that. And maybe you don't even realize that you're doing this. You be tactful. Fourth thing that you should check out in yourself is, do you hold grudges? Similar to, are you withholding grace from people, but are you not forgiving? Are you holding on to things that you should have gotten over a long time ago? Maybe you tell them or you think to yourself, I'll trust you again if you do this. They have to work their way out of whatever hole that you see that they've dug themselves in. But it's just this overly hypercritical attitude that we can have when we should just say, I forgive you, instead of making these judgment calls. The last thing I'll say on this, something to pay attention to, is that you'd rather point out a flaw. In conversation, you feel more comfortable pointing out a flaw in someone's life. And maybe sometimes you disguise it as a joke. Maybe it's a situation where you should be celebrating someone for something, but you shoot them down with a little funny joke because you're more comfortable pointing out a flaw than you are with actually celebrating them and giving them the congratulations that they are due. So think about that. What's more likely to come out of your mouth in conversation? Are you more likely to be critical? Are you more likely to point out a flaw? Or are you more likely to say congratulations, to say something uplifting, encouraging? We could go on and on with examples, but I'm trusting that you get the point. We don't need to be overly critical of others. Being overly critical is part of what I believe Jesus is getting at here when he says, judge not. You have to admit, though, that this person, this overly critical person, maybe you're even thinking of someone. Maybe you're thinking of yourself right now. Ultimately, if that's the case, that's what we need. That's where we need to get with this. Maybe you're thinking of someone and you would admit that it's not fun to be around that person. It's not fun to be around that person that's hypercritical of you, that's judging. Whether it's a classmate, a parent, older sibling, whatever, it's just not fun. So I want to give you a piece of life-changing advice from my high school football coach, okay? Don't be that guy. Don't do it. Don't be that guy, okay? I know that's obviously very simple to say. It's harder to do. But don't be the person that is constantly pointing out and noticing the flaws in other people before you've even thought about yourself and how you're doing in that regard and what you're doing with your life. Because the warning is clear. God will judge you the way that you judge other people, with the measure. So if your measure of judgment is hypercritical, is condescending, is condemning, then that's the measure that you will receive. But if your measure is merciful, it's patient, kind, that's the measure that you'll receive. So we get it. We got it, right? Being overly critical, it's not good. Jesus speaks out against that. Okay, I gave you that life-changing advice. Don't be that guy, right? But how do we do that? Let's think about how do we actually go about listening to my high school football coach? How do we do this? Jesus, he gets into this parable that gives us the answer of how to avoid this unbiblical attitude, right? He says, "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is the log in your own eye?" Now, look, I know that this is something that you've probably all heard a lot, but let's not miss the humor in what Jesus is saying. Can we just admire that for a second? This is funny. Jesus is being funny right now. So how can you think about getting the speck? Think about like when you have a little piece of dust in your eye, it's making your eye water, right? It's not even visible. How can you go there? How can you think about getting that out of your friend's eye or your brother's eye when you have a log sticking out of your eye? Like, you guys have seen the log trucks I'm talking about? Even if they have those around here. That's maybe my East Coast, I don't know. You know what I'm talking about, the big logs. Like, coming out of your eye. How can you even fathom going there about a speck when you have that thing sticking out of your eye? That's humorous, that's funny. And I think that we lose sight of that because of how often we have heard this before. But how helpful is that, really? Jesus is, this is very clear, really. A lot of, not all of his parables are at times, but this is very clear. So to overcome this attitude, this mindset of being hypercritical, of being overly critical, you got to realize that you and I, we have just as big of a mess, maybe even a bigger one than other people in our lives that we have to deal with, right? We're not perfect. We'll never be perfect, but sometimes we can go about life and we can, just think, I got it figured out and my friend doesn't. I got it figured out and my sibling doesn't. I got it figured out and fill in the blank. That person doesn't. And we get this way whenever we're not reflecting on our own shortcomings. That's their second point. You can write that down. Reflect on your own shortcomings. Reflect on it. We think about other people's problems way more than we think of our own. You can maybe sit in class or you can lay in bed at night and you can just think about. And you're just like boiling up in frustration about what this person said to you, what that person did to you, how this person behaves when they're around you. And you're reflecting on their attitude, on their mindset, and the way they're treating, but you sat there for half an hour thinking about this and you not once thought about your own life and your own shortcomings and where you need to take the log out of your own eye. We think about other people's problems way more than we think of our own, and we shouldn't do that. It's much more comfortable to think about other people's problems. It's comfortable because what are we doing? We're thinking about what they're doing wrong. We don't have to deal with what's going on in our own lives. We can make ourselves feel better that way. And honestly, it can be much more fun to think about the problems that other people are having than thinking about our own. But it's foolish to do that. So Jesus is getting at, he's saying that's what a fool does. A fool walks around with a log sticking out of their eye. Again, let's go there. All right, this is it's picture words, right? We're painting a picture. Jesus is helping us. Imagine walking around with a log sticking out of your eye. It's bumping into people. People are noticing it. It's really awkward all the time. And you're always pointing out, hey, you got to fix that little thing. You got a little stain on your shirt. That's ridiculous. But it's so easy to fall into that. It's foolish. We can think about other people, but most likely what we're doing is we're committing the same mistakes in our own lives or some form or fashion of that issue that you're upset about with someone else. But if we're not reflecting about our lives, if we're not thinking deeply about what we're doing, about what we are saying, we're going to miss this step. And if we're not thinking about what we're doing, this is how we can very quickly fall into this attitude of being a hypocrite, of being self-righteous, if we're not thinking about the way that we speak to people. Maybe you got upset because you felt like someone was disrespectful to you. Maybe you've written someone off because they've been disrespectful to you one too many times. But you're not thinking about the way that you speak to that person. You're not thinking about the way that you speak to people in general. You're not thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about the way that you steward your time and your finances, but you're frustrated at your friend because she's really bad with money. but you're not very good at it either. You're frustrated about someone's level of discipline, but you're not disciplined either. You're struggling in work because you're looking at your phone too much at work, or you're struggling in school because you can't say no to hanging out. You're not doing well with your spiritual disciplines because you can't say no to, you know what it is. But too often we're very fast to notice this in other people and not actually be thinking about our own shortcomings. So if you spend even just a few minutes considering these things, asking God to reveal them to you, right? Like Psalm 139 talks about, revealing our sin. God, show me where I'm falling short. God's going to reveal it to you. You understand? It's biblical. He says to do that. So we need to be thinking about the way that we are falling short. Ultimately, of course, because, when I say falling short, I do mean where we're sinning. And we should be on a journey as Christians to say, I'm trying to become pure like my Savior. I don't want to be living in these sins anymore, but if all I'm doing is thinking about the sins of other people and the way that makes me feel, then I'm not going to do any time thinking about my own shortcomings. So let's be determined to think about our own, because we do not want to turn into hypocrites. When I was in high school, lots of high school stories coming up today, I guess. I worked out at an Olympic weightlifting gym that doesn't say anything about myself, okay? It just tells you that's where I worked out at, because that's where my coach told me to work out. I have a lot of respect for my coach. He gave me a lot of good advice, okay? Told me to work out here, so I'm going to this gym, and it's owned by these guys that used to be in the Olympics, lifting like big crazy. And the owner, had two sons, Will and Mikey. Mikey was the older son. Will was a couple years younger. Mikey was like my age. These dudes were strong. Like, I'm talking like power clean and jerk, like hundreds of pounds over the head, like squatting, just like nuts how much, and these were like teenagers. These kids were strong. Mikey had a bad habit of missing a rep. He would drop the weights. He would drop the bar off his back in a squat, or he'd miss the power clean and drop it. And he had a bad habit of yelling profanity after that. He would scream cuss words in the gym, and no one would correct him because everyone was afraid of Mikey. Not even the trainers in the gym would correct this kid because His brother, though, did what he did, not with good stuff. He would help him. Mikey would help his brother with form and all that stuff. But what Will started doing was he picked up on that same bad habit. And I remember this very, very clearly. We were in the gym working out. Will was attempting to do a power clean and jerk of some new PR or something, and he dropped it. And what did he do? He yelled out a cuss word, screamed it for the whole gym to hear, and. Whatever, I was kind of expected. I did not expect what happened next. Older brother, Mikey, from across the gym, yells at his brother, "Hey, watch your mouth!" It was the most absurd thing. It was so crazy. I'm like, dude, you just did that. Like, I don't understand, Now, that's it's not really mind-blowing. You've all seen something like that happen. You've all maybe even done something like that. But seriously, think about it with me. How foolish, right? How foolish is that? There is a giant log sticking out of Mikey's eye, and he yells across the gym in front of everybody, "Hey, watch your mouth." Not once did he think about, oh yeah, actually, I do that too. We can think about that type of situation and go, yeah, wow, that's ridiculous. I can't believe that happened, but we do very similar things. We do that especially whenever we're not reflecting on our own shortcomings. We're not thinking about our sin and what needs to be dealt with in our lives. We've got to be busy thinking about ourselves before we can even start to think about talking to other people and pointing out their flaws and their issues. We don't want to be self-righteous. We don't want to be hypocritical. We need to know what we're dealing with. Think about that. Maybe if someone asked you that question, what are you struggling with? What sins are you dealing with? Would you have an answer? A real specific answer, by the way, not just a general patience. Okay, join the club, right? We all live in California. We drive here. Everybody, a real answer. Would you be able to say something? Do you know your own shortcomings? Verse 5, the last verse Jesus says here, well, at least the last one we're going to look at. He says, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." So that's the danger that Jesus is guarding us against, right? We've said it, we've been saying it all throughout. He's guarding us against hypocrisy. He's guarding us against pretending with our lives, pretending that we're something that we're not. He spells out very clearly how to avoid this. He says, there's a log in your eye, take out the log. You have to notice there's a log there, and you have to take it out. And then, when there's not a log sticking out of your eye, guess what's going to happen? Your eye is going to work better. Because there's not a log in your eye. It's going to work. So in other words, we can gather a few things here. We need to humbly admit our own problems. Humbly, be humble and admit that we have shortcomings, that we have failures, that we need to address. And then exactly that, it needs to be addressed. It needs to be taken care of, it needs to be repented of, it needs to be confessed. And then, and only then, is Jesus saying that we can see clearly to go and address the speck in our brother's eye. At that point, we're letting love for our brother motivate us to point out the speck, not the feeling of self-righteousness, not wanting to be happy or pleased with ourselves in some way, thinking that maybe God will be happy with us because we're pointing out other people's problems. But it's love that's motivating it now. So last point, avoid hypocrisy through humility and love. We can avoid being hypocritical if we have humility and we have genuine love for the people around us. Humility is needed if we're going to admit faults. Humility is needed if we're going to go before God and confess our sins, especially if you're in a pattern of hypocrisy currently. If you have a self-righteous attitude currently, it takes a lot of humility to hear this, to hear the words of Christ, and then to go, yeah, he's talking about me. But it's needed. I get it, though. No one enjoys being wrong. No one enjoys being at fault in a situation. Pride would much rather call out the issues in other people than deal with what's going on in its own heart. Pride would much rather think too highly of itself. Romans 12, verse 3 says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think." It's really the heart of what's going on whenever we have an unaddressed log in our eye, is we're thinking way too highly of ourselves. We're putting ourselves above other people in some regard, thinking that we have some divine calling or some commissioning to be the person that helps people see their problems. But we're thinking too highly of ourselves. So we need humility. You got to be realistic in this. You got to admit your faults and have the humility then and the confidence and the trust as well to confront your shortcomings. Not to just notice it and do nothing about it, noticing your sin and then doing nothing about it. It does nothing. So maybe you've come to think too highly of yourself. Maybe you're struggling in this regard. You need humility. You need to pray and ask God to give you humility in this. And then you need to trust that He's going to answer that prayer. If you pray and you ask and you trust, that's a prayer that I believe is according to His will, and He'll give you that humility. We have to be sincere, though. We have to be genuine about this. So what we're seeing now is we need to have love, genuine love. Once the log is removed, we can now, in good conscience, go to a brother, go to a friend, and address whatever the problem is. But it should be then and only then, after you've addressed the log. And there's major difference between this kind of correction and then being overly critical, right? One is done for selfish reasons, and the other is done selflessly. One is done maliciously. The other is done out of compassion. So correction after you've dealt with the log in your own eye, it should only come from the love that you have for your brother, for your sister, for your friend. And out of love, what you're going to do is you're going to be gentle, you're going to be tactful, You're going to be careful the way that Jesus would have us address the speck in someone else's eye. So let's not over-criticize and judge. Let's be humble. Let's be willing to deal with our own shortcomings. Let's make sure that we're guarding against these issues of hypocrisy and self-righteousness. Let's pray. Lord, I know this is a familiar passage, and unfortunately what can happen with familiar things is they can become too familiar and we can stop paying attention to it. God, I pray that we would not have that mindset towards this, that we would understand how important it is, would understand how easy, how quickly we can fall into being the type of people that judge in the way that you condemn. Help us to be honest with ourselves first. Help us to notice whatever log we have coming out of our own eye before we will address anything and anyone else. And God, every time that we do address something else in someone else's life, God, let it be done from the right place, from love and care after we have thought deeply about ourselves and what we're doing. God, we want to honor you with our lives in this way. So help us to do that, Lord. We love you. Amen.